At release, MSFS did not have working VNAV in airliners. 2 years on, I want to find out if that's still the case. Have Asobo finally achieved feature parity with the 25-year-old sims that I've been flying recently? We're using the CaptainSim 777, which functionally is identical to the default 747 by Asobo. So this will give us a good indication of the state of VNAV in the default aircraft. We've set up a flight plan from Stansted to Glasgow with a departure, an approach, an arrival, and no discontinuities. We've set a cruising altitude of a very achievable 26,000 feet, and we filled in the perf pages for takeoff. Essentially, we've done everything you need to do for VNAV to work normally. Our MCP is correctly configured with LNAV and VNAV enabled, auto throttle enabled. Flight directors are enabled. Our initial speed is set in excess of our V2 speed, and our altitude is set to our cruising altitude. As we take off, we rotate at our assigned rotate speed, bring the gear up a positive rate, and we'll switch on the autopilot once we've cleared 400 feet. The aircraft should now climb in VNAV mode, so managing its own speed and its own altitude in line with the restrictions set on the FMC. What actually happens in MSFS is VNAV is currently just a dumb climb mode, so it will climb at 250 knots below 10,000 feet to your cruising altitude. It will bust through any altitude restrictions set in your FMC, which currently makes it unsuitable for use on VATSIM or similar. The one thing that MSFS aircraft currently do correctly is when they hit 10,000 feet, they will accelerate from 250 knots up to your cruising speed, and they'll level off to enable them to do this before resuming their climb. At cruising altitude, the plane does correctly transition into VNAV path mode and level off. What we'll do now is the same as we do in any aircraft with VNAV, which is find the lowest bottom of descent altitude in the FMC and dial that into the MCP so the plane can automatically descend to it when it reaches its top of descent. I've also configured approach ref, which is necessary for the deceleration mode to work on approach to the airport. Whether this makes a difference in MSFS, we'll find out a little later on. So here's the first piece of bizarre behaviour we encounter. At cruising altitude, so way before top of descent and way before deceleration, the plane randomly decelerates to 240 knots. Another strange thing I noticed during the cruise is the plane would randomly violently pitch up and down, losing and gaining altitude. This issue must be related to the VNAV mode because it doesn't happen when you just use flight level change mode and control your altitude and speed manually. As we pass through what should be top of descent, that is the last waypoint in the FMC at cruising altitude, the plane should descend, but what it actually does is nothing. Now we need to be at 7,000 feet at Lanark in 23 miles. So I go up to the MCP and hit altitude intervention. Even then the plane takes its time before it finally starts its descent. Strangely enough, a feature that does work is deceleration. So before the decel waypoint, the plane will start to slow down to 174 knots. That's not the 159 knots we've set as our approach speed, but hopefully it will step its way down to that. Instead of slowing down to approach speed, what it actually does is slow down to about 135, 139 knots, which is just above stall speed. So as we approach bottom of descent, it does some really weird stuff. It goes into VNAV out mode, then starts climbing again. The speed hovers around 150 knots, but that's not because that's what we've set as our approach speed. It just happens to be sitting there. As you'll see in a second, it decides to accelerate again to the 174 knots that's specified on the speed tape. In fact, it actually busts through that speed and starts heading towards 180 knots before backing off again to 174. And after the brief unexplained panic climb, it starts to descend again towards our desired altitude, our bottom of descent. Obviously this behaviour is completely weird and completely wrong. And again, it is just a side effect of having VNAV switched on. Because as I said earlier, if you use flight level change mode and set a speed on the MCP, you can ascend and descend with no problem at all. And you'll see here, At our bottom of descent, it finally correctly goes into VNAV path mode and holds that altitude. As we enter the approach phase of the flight, the good news is the plane has no trouble intercepting the localizer, holding its altitude until the glide slope, and then following the glide slope. There is still no autopilot 2 or auto land mode in any of the default aircraft. But weirdly enough, rollout and flare annunciators do appear on the PFD. So as we come to the end of this video, what have we learned? There's no auto land. The ILS at Glasgow is hideously misaligned. But most importantly, we've learned that no, VNAV still doesn't work in MSFS. There are some add-on aircraft that have implemented it. The fly-by-wire A32NX is not one of these, it still uses a dumb climb and descend mode. And that ultimately this is pretty disappointing, as I was flying planes designed for Flight Sim 2004 that had perfectly functional VNAV. I still recommend that in MSFS you fly using flight level change mode and set your speed on the MCP, as I do in all of my MSFS tutorials. When VNAV starts working in default aircraft, and when more sophisticated add-ons with VNAV such as the PMDG arrive, I will of course use it in my videos for those planes. But until then, thank you for watching. If you did find this useful or entertaining, please drop a like, and please feel free to subscribe as I make this kind of content fairly regularly. Take care, and I'll see you next time.